The Galactic Empire had long maintained a delicate balance, an unspoken agreement with the galaxy's numerous factions. For centuries, it ruled with a cold hand, keeping the peace through overwhelming military power and the threat of annihilation. Despite the widespread resentment it sparked, the Empire's technological superiority and strategic influence had left most species with little choice but to comply. Systems that tried to defy it were swiftly crushed, and those that remained neutral existed in constant fear of becoming targets. But peace, as always, had a price. Alien species, forced to bow under the Empire's will, began to show signs of unrest. Old alliances that once held firm started to crumble. Whispers of rebellion spread like wildfire, carried on the winds of interstellar trade routes and secret meetings. Humanity, a species just beginning to emerge on the galactic stage, had managed to carve out a surprising role for itself. Though they were few in number compared to the Empire or the established alien powers, they had one distinct advantage, something the galaxy's elder species had not anticipated: ingenuity. Humans were natural diplomats, able to navigate the complex political and cultural minefields of galactic politics. They hadn't been drawn into the conflict at first, observing from the sidelines, but the time had come for them to step into the fray. Ambassador Jonathan Carter was one of humanity's finest, a man who had risen through the ranks of diplomacy, not through force of arms, but through sheer intellect and a deep understanding of the galaxy's ever-changing dynamics. Carter's reputation was built on his ability to understand the nuances of alien cultures, the subtle shifts in power that went unnoticed by most, and his uncanny ability to turn even the most impossible situations into victories. It was this very skill that the Galactic Council had relied upon when they called him to resolve the latest crisis. The crisis had begun innocuously enough. A peaceful planet, Silas IV, had been caught in the Empire's expansionist gaze. The planet had no strategic value, no military importance. It was simply a resource-rich world, ripe for the picking. The Empire's usual tactics, subtle threats, economic pressure, and the occasional military show of force, were usually enough to bring even the most stubborn systems to heel. But this time, something had gone wrong. The planet's leaders had refused to comply, and in response, the Empire had deployed its military might. The Imperial fleet appeared above Silas IV in an act of breathtaking audacity. The Empire, accustomed to having its demands met with little more than a whimper, had underestimated the resistance. Instead of bowing to the inevitable, the citizens of Silas IV had organized themselves. What followed was an unexpected rebellion, a planet-wide struggle for independence, with no clear victor in sight. The situation was escalating fast, and soon, entire star systems would be caught in the crossfire. The Galactic Council had met in emergency session, desperate for a solution before the conflict spread further. They knew the risks of angering the Empire, but they couldn't afford to lose Silas IV, or allow the Empire to claim it without facing consequences. That's when Carter had been called in. He had been briefed on the situation, a single, unrelenting fact echoing in his mind. The galaxy stood on the brink of war. The Empire's aggression could not be ignored, but even the slightest misstep could push the galaxy into a conflict it wasn't prepared for. As he prepared to depart for the summit, Carter stood before the window of his office, staring out at the stars. The vast expanse of space stretched out before him, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. His mission was clear: negotiate peace, but peace in a galaxy where the Empire's grip was tightening, where everyone had their own agenda, was a fragile thing. He knew what he was up against. The Empire wouldn't give in easily. But Carter also knew one thing: he was the only one who could make them. The storm was coming, and Jonathan Carter had no choice but to stand at the center of it. The summit was held in a neutral space station known as the Horizon Nexus, a massive construct floating at the edge of the galaxy's most contested space. It was a place where the galaxy's most powerful leaders could meet, far from the watchful eyes of their enemies, and try to broker peace in an environment where everyone was supposed to feel equal. Yet even here, Tension was palpable. As the council members filed into the grand chamber, it was impossible not to feel the weight of what was at stake. Leaders from various species exchanged uneasy glances, each one knowing that their next move could determine whether their homeworlds would be consumed by war. The Empire's presence loomed large, with Lord Kale, the Empire's representative, taking his place at the head of the table. Tall, imposing, with a face carved from stone, Kale exuded an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His dark eyes scanned the room, daring anyone to challenge the Empire's supremacy. On the opposite end of the table, Jonathan Carter stood with quiet composure. He was not a towering figure, physically unimposing compared to Kale, but he commanded attention nonetheless. His reputation had preceded him. Human diplomacy was still a new force, but it had already made waves. Carter had spent years navigating complex negotiations between human colonies and alien factions, and his success was built on his ability to understand the intricacies of each race's values and motivations. Now, as he stepped forward, he was determined to prove that humanity's greatest strength was not its military might, but its intelligence and ability to adapt. "Thank you all for attending," Carter began, his voice steady and measured. "We've been brought here today because the galaxy stands at a crossroads. The actions of the Empire have pushed us to the brink of war, but war is not inevitable. There is always a chance for peace, even in the darkest times." The room was quiet, the tension still thick. Some factions were skeptical of Carter's words, while others looked on with cautious optimism. But all eyes were on Kale, who had yet to speak. Lord Kale finally leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "Peace," he echoed. "You speak of peace, human. The Empire has acted to ensure stability. Our might is the foundation upon which this galaxy stands. What do you know of stability?" Carter didn't flinch. "I know that stability built on fear is fragile. The Empire's presence has never brought true peace. It has only brought subjugation, resentment, and rebellion. You've driven countless systems into opposition, and now you've pushed Silas IV into open rebellion. You can't force peace through threats. It only breeds more conflict." Kel's lips curled into a smirk. "You are naive, Ambassador. You think your diplomacy can undo centuries of Empire rule. We don't need your speeches. The galaxy will bend to our will. This meeting is a waste of time." The challenge hung in the air. Carter's heart raced, but his expression remained calm. He had expected this kind of arrogance from the Empire, but it only fueled his determination. "I don't need your approval, Lord Kale," Carter replied, his tone unwavering. "But if we're going to avoid war, we must look beyond our differences and find a way to coexist. I'm not here to surrender or negotiate under duress. I'm here to offer you a choice: war or something different." The silence that followed was thick. Carter's words echoed in the minds of the other delegates. He had said it, something different. But what was it? Kel's eyes narrowed. "And what would that be?" he asked, a hint of mockery in his voice. Carter stepped forward, his mind already racing through possible solutions, aware of the gravity of what he was about to propose. "A challenge," he said, his voice steady but firm. "A contest of diplomacy, strategy, and intellect. Instead of fighting battles, we'll fight with our minds. I propose a series of tests, each designed to showcase the strength of diplomacy, not brute force." Kel's face darkened. "A contest?" he asked, disbelief creeping into his tone. "You want to pit your mind against the might of the Empire?" "Yes," Carter said, his gaze unwavering. "If the Empire believes it can secure peace through strength, let's see if it can do so through wisdom. If you win, the galaxy will submit to your will. But if I win, the Empire must step back, cease its aggressive expansion, and allow the galaxy to chart its own course." The room erupted into whispers. Some delegates exchanged uncertain glances, while others seemed intrigued by the idea. Carter had just laid the foundation for a gamble, one that could either save the galaxy or plunge it into a war like never before. Lord Kale, ever the cynic, leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. And you believe that a human can outmatch the greatest minds of the Empire? You're not even a strategist, Ambassador. You are merely a diplomat. Carter's lips curled into a small smile. I don't need to be a strategist, Lord Kale. I only need to be better than you. Kale's eyes flickered with a brief flash of anger, but the challenge had been set. Carter had managed to do what many thought impossible. He had forced the Empire's hand, and in doing so, he had changed the game entirely. The summit would not be about negotiation or military power. It would be about something far more dangerous, an intellectual contest that would determine the fate of the galaxy. The atmosphere in the council chamber shifted dramatically after Carter's bold proposal. The murmurs grew louder, and the air was thick with uncertainty and intrigue. Some factions seemed uneasy, unsure of what such a contest would mean. Others were beginning to lean toward Carter's challenge, seeing a chance to bring the Empire to its knees without a single shot being fired. Even the Empire's allies, usually so loyal to the Imperial cause, exchanged glances, unsure of the wisdom in dismissing the human's proposition outright. Cal's expression, however, remained impassive. He hadn't expected Carter to be so audacious, but the ambassador's calm demeanor in the face of such hostility was something Cal couldn't ignore. If there was one thing Cal respected, it was strength. And while he had mocked Carter's proposal, something in the back of his mind told him that this human might just be more than he had anticipated. I will accept your challenge, Ambassador, Cal finally declared, his voice cold but measured. But be warned, this will not end in the way you hope. You are playing with forces you cannot comprehend. Carter's eyes narrowed, but he kept his calm. I'm not the one who's underestimated my opponent, Lord Cal, he replied. You may be powerful, but you've become too reliant on that power. Now you'll see how your military might stands up to something you've never had to face before, true diplomacy. The contest would take place in a series of rounds, each one designed to test different aspects of diplomatic skill and strategy. The first round, which was to be held the next day, would focus on a simple yet critical exercise. Negotiation. Two factions, one chosen by Carter, the other by the Empire, would engage in talks over a disputed trade route, with the stakes being the future of their economies. Both sides had conflicting interests, but the challenge lay in how each side would manage to balance their needs while avoiding escalation into conflict. As Carter made his way back to his quarters that night, he couldn't help but think about the weight of the task ahead. He had never faced anything like this before. In typical diplomatic circles, negotiations were complicated, yes, but not life or death. But this contest was different. It wasn't just about saving Silas IV. It was about proving that the galaxy didn't have to bend to the will of the Empire. Carter had to win, not just for humanity's sake, but for the future of the entire galaxy. The next morning, the round began. The two chosen representatives from each faction took their seats at the large, circular table. The representatives from the Empire were sharp-eyed, dressed in the dark uniforms that marked their allegiance. Across from them sat the representatives from the neutral system, chosen by Carter for their ability to think critically and act independently. Carter knew they would need to be sharp if they were to stand a chance against the Empire's heavy-handed tactics. The negotiation was tense from the start. The Empire's representative, a calculating strategist named Karen Vex, immediately began making demands, unreasonable ones, hoping to pressure the neutral faction into concessions. He was ruthless, offering no compromise and no flexibility. His arrogance was evident in every word he spoke. But Carter had anticipated this. He had studied Vex's tactics and knew exactly how to respond. He had chosen his team carefully, picking representatives who had experience in high-stakes negotiations. The neutral faction's lead negotiator, a sharp-witted diplomat named Liravel, immediately countered Vex's opening demands with a proposal that not only met some of his demands, but gave them a future stake in the trade route's development. It was a brilliant move, one that shifted the tone of the entire negotiation. The Empire had expected the neutral faction to back down, to give in to their demands. But Carter had ensured that they would fight for what they deserved. As the back and forth continued, Carter watched with growing satisfaction. Vex's confident facade began to crack as Laravel expertly parried every one of his attempts to dominate the conversation. With every turn, the neutral faction not only held their ground but made progress toward a fair agreement. Carter knew this round was crucial. If he could push the Empire to compromise, even slightly, he would win a significant victory in the contest. In the final moments of the round, Vex reluctantly agreed to terms that were far from what he had hoped for, but far better than the complete capitulation he had anticipated. The neutral faction, with Carter's subtle guidance, secured the trade route with equitable terms for both sides, and the Empire had been forced to accept a more balanced agreement. The council chamber erupted in applause, but the Empire was silent. Lord Kell's lips were pressed into a tight line, and the Emperor's delegates looked anything but pleased. For the first time in the contest, the Empire had lost, not due to military force, but to the power of negotiation. Carter stood tall as he walked from the table, his mind already turning toward the next round. He knew this was just the beginning, but the first victory was a clear signal. The Empire was not invincible. The shock of the first round's outcome had barely settled when the tension in the summit chamber ratcheted up. The neutral faction's victory over the Empire in the trade route negotiation was a blow to Lord Kell's pride, but it was far from the worst thing that could happen. His first instinct was to brush off the defeat as a fluke, but something in the back of his mind gnawed at him. The human diplomat, Carter, had done something the Empire rarely encountered. He had outsmarted them, not with brute force, but with cleverness and patience. That, more than the actual loss, stung. Kell's mind raced as he considered his options. He couldn't afford another loss. The next round, a test of diplomacy and strategy, would be even more challenging. But he had no intention of allowing the humans' clever tactics to undermine the Empire's dominance. The stakes were high, and the Emperor had made it clear that failure was not an option. As the second round loomed, Kell began to plot his next move. If Carter could win using his intellect, then Kell would have to neutralize that advantage by taking matters into his own hands, by disrupting Carter's reputation and undermining his position within the summit. The diplomatic contest was about more than just strategy. It was about perception, and if Kell could shift the Council's perception of Carter, the human would lose his edge. Meanwhile, Carter remained focused on the task at hand. Though he had won the first round, he knew the battle was far from over. The second round would test his ability to outmaneuver the Empire at their own game. It would involve a series of complex debates about the future of galaxy-wide trade, with each side trying to secure their interests in front of the full council. Carter had prepared extensively for this round, ensuring that his team was ready for every angle the Empire might take. But as he walked into the summit the following day, Carter noticed an unsettling change. Some of the delegates from other factions were whispering behind their hands, casting quick, uneasy glances at him. It wasn't until he reached his seat that he understood why. The Empire had already begun its underhanded campaign. On the holographic display in front of him, a series of documents flickered into view. They were brief snippets from an anonymous source, documents purportedly about Carter's past, alleging that he had once made decisions that led to the destruction of an entire colony in a failed diplomatic mission. It was a claim he knew was false, but the damage had already been done. The whispers had spread. Doubts about his judgment, about his integrity, were beginning to take root in the minds of the council members. Lord Kell's voice cut through the rising tension like a blade. "Ambassador Carter," he said, his tone dripping with feigned concern, "it seems there are certain questions regarding your past. Perhaps you'd like to address these rumors before we proceed." Carter kept his expression neutral, though inside, a cold fury began to build. He had expected the Empire to fight dirty, but this was lower than even he had anticipated. The document was nothing but a fabrication, but the implications were powerful. He couldn't allow it to stand. With deliberate calm, Carter rose to his feet. He knew how to turn a situation like this to his advantage. If Kel wanted to drag his reputation through the mud, then Carter would expose the Empire's own corruption in the process. "Lord Kel, you seem to have misplaced your sources," Carter said evenly, addressing the council. "The documents you refer to are nothing but lies, created to distract you from the real issues at hand. I have no intention of defending myself against baseless accusations. However, if we are to talk about trust and leadership, let us look at the Empire's own record." Carter's words hung in the air as the council members fell silent, their attention rapt. The Empire has conquered countless systems, leaving behind nothing but devastation and broken promises. Your forces have turned entire planets into rubble, with no regard for the lives lost in the process. If you want to question my integrity, perhaps it is time for the Empire to face the same scrutiny. The room was electric with tension. Kel's face tightened, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't respond immediately. Carter had turned the tables. He wasn't just defending himself. He was putting the Empire on trial, publicly. Kel struggled to keep his composure, his usual confidence slipping for the first time. His voice was low, almost a growl. "You will regret this, human. You may have won one round, but in the end, the Empire will prevail." Carter's eyes met Kel's, and for the first time, there was a hint of a smile on his lips. "We'll see about that, Lord Kel. The galaxy is watching, and if the Empire's true nature is exposed, it won't be me who regrets anything." As the second round began, Carter knew that the battle for the galaxy's future was only intensifying. The Empire's tactics might have shifted, but he wasn't backing down. The game was far from over, and now, more than ever, Carter was determined to prove that diplomacy, and not military might, would win the day. The fallout from the Empire's underhanded tactic had left the Council shaken, but it had also forced everyone to reevaluate their perception of Jonathan Carter. The subtle smear campaign, intended to weaken his position, had instead opened the door for him to expose the true nature of the Empire. Carter had turned the tables with calculated precision, making the Empire's actions seem far more corrupt than the supposed rumors about him. The eyes of the galaxy were now on the summit, and Carter's stock had never been higher. Despite the victory in the court of public opinion, the next round of the contest would be even more difficult. The Empire was not one to back down easily. Lord Kel had already made it clear that he would not tolerate further challenges to his authority. The third round of the contest was set to test the two factions' strategic planning, with each side tasked with organizing a defense plan for a hypothetical galactic crisis. It was the kind of exercise the Empire excelled in, relying on its military superiority to dominate any situation. Carter, however, had no intention of following the Empire's playbook. He knew that this was his moment to solidify his position and prove once and for all that the Empire's strength was nothing without the support of the galaxy. His strategy was simple: outthink them, not outgun them. The game was about to shift again, and Carter was ready. The council chamber was buzzing with anticipation as the representatives took their seats. This time, the stakes were personal. Lord Kel stood, tall and imposing, his posture betraying little of the frustration he must have been feeling. "Let us proceed," he said with a tone that bordered on condescension. "Let's see how a human attempts to outsmart the might of the Empire." Carter stood up, unfazed by Kel's provocations. "We won't be focusing on the sheer strength of our fleets," he said, addressing the council with quiet confidence. "We'll be looking at the strength of our alliances and our ability to lead. A truly effective defense is built on trust, cooperation, and mutual respect. These are the things the Empire lacks." As Carter spoke, his voice steady and clear, the other delegates began to nod in agreement. Carter's plan was unconventional, but it struck a chord with many of the factions who had grown tired of the Empire's heavy-handed tactics. The idea of leading through trust and cooperation, rather than dominance and fear, was a refreshing change from the Empire's usual approach. Lord Kel's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. He was clearly irritated by Carter's approach. but it was clear he would have to play along for now. The Empire had always relied on overwhelming military might, but Carter's vision for the galaxy presented a direct challenge to that paradigm. For the next few hours, both sides presented their plans, outlining strategies for responding to a massive intergalactic crisis that threatened to destabilize the galaxy. While Kel's plan focused on rapid military response, the use of overwhelming force, and tactical strikes, Carter's approach focused on diplomacy, establishing multi-system alliances, and offering humanitarian aid to the affected populations. The focus was on stabilizing the region through cooperation, providing resources, and ensuring that no one faction would be left behind in the pursuit of peace. When the two plans were put to vote, the results were unexpected. Carter's plan, while less conventional, won the support of most of the council members. It was clear that the galaxy was ready for a new approach, one that valued cooperation over dominance, diplomacy over war. Lord Kel's face darkened as the results were announced. His plan, designed to showcase the Empire's strength, had been rejected in favor of a strategy that emphasized unity and collaboration. For the first time in the summit, Kel had lost decisively. The vote was a turning point. Carter had not only won the third round but had also made a powerful statement. The future of the galaxy was not in the hands of the Empire, but in the hands of those who valued peace and cooperation. Carter returned to his seat, a quiet smile on his face. He knew the Empire would not give up easily, but this victory was important. The tide was turning, and for the first time, it seemed possible that the galaxy might be able to chart its own course without the shadow of the Empire looming over it. The challenge was far from over, but Carter was more determined than ever. The next round would be critical, but he now had the support of the Council, and the galaxy's eyes were on him. He had proven that diplomacy, not just might, could shape the future of the galaxy. Carter had hoped that the third round would be a turning point in the contest, and in many ways, it had been. His victory over the Empire's military-centric strategy had earned him the respect of the Council, and for the first time, many delegates saw humanity's approach to diplomacy as a legitimate path forward. But he knew the Empire would not take this defeat lying down. Lord Kel, ever the strategist, would undoubtedly be plotting his next move. As the summit progressed into the fourth round, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The atmosphere had shifted once again. Where once the Empire had been confident in its dominance, now there was an undercurrent of desperation in Kel's every move. But it wasn't just Kel's demeanor that troubled Carter. He began noticing subtle hints of disruption. Discreet conversations, hushed tones, and the occasional glance exchanged between Kel and a few of the more influential delegates who had been vocal in their support of the Empire. It was clear that the Empire was trying something new. The fourth round would test the negotiators' ability to handle an ethical dilemma. The scenario presented was a complex one. An ancient and powerful alien artifact, discovered on the border between two hostile systems, was being offered to the Council. Whoever controlled the artifact would hold immense power. It was a tempting prize for both factions, and it presented a moral quandary. Should the artifact be used to further personal agendas, or should it be protected and kept neutral to prevent further conflict? Carter, ever the diplomat, saw this round as an opportunity to prove that the true strength of leadership came from making the hard decisions. He had already formulated his plan, a proposal that suggested the artifact should be placed under the protection of a neutral governing body. It would be used as a tool for peace, not power. As he presented his proposal, he could feel the eyes of the Council on him. His plan was elegant, balancing the need for security with the larger goal of peace. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was the right one. He made it clear that the artifact would be most dangerous if used as a weapon, and that only by treating it with the utmost care and respect could the galaxy avoid a war over it. Lord Kel, however, was not so easily deterred. His plan was starkly different. He proposed that the artifact be placed directly under the control of the Empire, arguing that the Empire's superior military might would ensure it would be safeguarded from misuse. His voice dripped with condescension as he spoke, dismissing Carter's proposal as naive and impractical. He suggested that only the Empire's strength could maintain peace in a galaxy rife with instability. Ambassador Carter speaks of peace, but in a galaxy like ours, peace must be enforced, Cale said, his eyes cold and calculating. The artifact is a weapon, and only those with the power to wield it can ensure its proper use. You cannot trust every system to act in the interest of the greater good. The Empire will bring stability. Carter didn't flinch. He had expected this kind of response. The Empire had never understood the value of collaboration, of shared power. They only saw control. But this was his moment to make the Council understand the deeper truth. He had one more chance to show them that cooperation, not domination, was the key to lasting peace. If the Empire takes control of the artifact, it will simply become another tool of tyranny, Carter said, his voice steady and resolute. We've seen this before. The Empire will claim that it acts in the name of stability, but it only creates division. The artifact's power could unite or destroy us. It is not the Empire's to claim, but the galaxy's to protect. A murmur ran through the room. For the first time, Carter's words seemed to resonate with more than just a few delegates. Even those who had previously sided with the Empire were beginning to question the wisdom of allowing a single faction to hold such power. Then came the twist. Cale's plan was sabotage. As he was about to rally more support for his proposal, an anonymous delegate from the Council stood and presented evidence that the Empire had already begun secretive operations to mine and study the artifact, even before the summit had started. It was a bold move that completely shattered Cale's argument. He had, in essence, shown his hand too early. His words about maintaining stability now sounded hollow in light of the evidence. The Council erupted into chaos. Whispers turned to shouts as the delegates turned on each other, accusations flying across the room. Cale stood frozen, his expression one of disbelief and fury. The Empire had been caught red-handed in an act of blatant overreach. It was the kind of scandal that could turn the tide of the summit in a way that no one had expected. Carter, his heart pounding, knew that this was his moment. He stepped forward again, his voice cutting through the noise. This is why we cannot allow the Empire to control the artifact. It is not just a symbol of power, it is a symbol of their disregard for the rest of the galaxy. We must stand together and protect it, not for any one faction, but for all of us. The Council slowly quieted, their eyes now firmly fixed on Carter. The tables had turned and Cale, once the dominant force, was now on the defensive. Carter had not only defeated him in another round, but he had exposed the Empire for what it truly was. The atmosphere in the Council chamber had shifted once more. The scandal over the Empire's secretive operations to control the artifact was a turning point, one that had left Lord Cale reeling. For the first time in the contest, the other delegates could no longer ignore the Empire's history of overreach and manipulation. Carter's words had struck a chord, and now it was clear. The galaxy was beginning to understand that true leadership came from collaboration, not domination. Cale, ever the seasoned tactician, knew he couldn't afford to lose another round. The contest was nearing its final phase, and if he didn't act quickly, Carter's influence would spread too far for the Empire to recover. As the delegates filed out of the summit to prepare for the final round, Cale's mind raced. He had lost the last 2 rounds, but he wasn't about to let the human diplomat walk away victorious. There had to be a way to turn the tide. The 5th and final round was set to challenge the 2 factions' ability to broker peace between 2 feuding systems. The systems had been at war for decades over disputed resources, and the task was simple: negotiate a ceasefire and find a long-term solution that would bring lasting peace. On the surface, it seemed like a diplomatic challenge that favored Carter's approach. After all, his strategy was based on cooperation and compromise. But Cale had something else in mind. Behind closed doors, the Empire had already begun making moves of its own. Cale knew that if he could maneuver the Council into supporting a more aggressive stance, he could regain the upper hand. He wasn't interested in the long-term peace Carter was pushing for. He wanted to prove that the Empire was still the galaxy's true power, even if it meant bending the rules of the contest. As the final round began, both Carter and Cale took their seats, the Council watching them intently. The two systems, Loria and Valen, had sent their representatives to the summit, each determined to see their side's interests protected. The tension in the room was palpable as the two factions took their positions, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Carter knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. He had studied the history of the conflict between Loria and Valen, and he understood the root of their animosity. The war wasn't just about resources, it was about trust, something that had been broken long ago. If he could get both sides to acknowledge their shared humanity, he believed they could find common ground. He began by addressing the representatives from both sides. "You've been at war for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to trust each other," Carter said, his voice calm but firm. "The resources you fight over are valuable, yes, but the greatest resource you have is the potential for peace. It's time to stop fighting and start working together. Only then can both of your people prosper." The representatives from Loria and Valen exchanged glances, skeptical but intrigued. Carter's words were a far cry from the Empire's usual approach of coercion and dominance. They could see the sincerity in his eyes. But Cale was determined not to let Carter have the last word. "It's easy to speak of peace," Cale interjected, his voice dripping with disdain. "But we live in a galaxy where power is the ultimate currency. The Empire offers stability. And with stability comes control, control that ensures your survival. Negotiation is a noble pursuit, Ambassador, but it will never match the Empire's ability to enforce the peace." Cale's words hung in the air, challenging Carter's approach. He leaned back in his chair, waiting for the delegates to react. For a moment, it seemed as if the Council might sway in his favor. After all, the Empire had the military strength to impose order. It was a tempting offer. But Carter wasn't done yet. He stood, his eyes meeting Cale's with quiet determination. "The Empire may offer control, but control breeds resentment," he said. "It breeds rebellion. What the galaxy needs now is not another empire built on fear, but a future built on trust. Trust that, despite our differences, we can work together for the greater good. We've seen what the Empire's way leads to. The galaxy doesn't need more violence. It needs more voices willing to listen." The Council members looked to one another, sensing the gravity of the choice before them. Cale's approach promised security, but at a cost: the subjugation of free systems. Carter's proposal, though idealistic, offered a chance for real peace, and it wasn't just a dream. It was a vision that many had longed for. The final vote was called. Cale's supporters rallied behind him, but Carter's message had resonated too deeply. The vote was close, but the Council ultimately sided with Carter. The future of Loria and Valen would no longer be decided by military might. Instead, it would be negotiated by those who sought peace and cooperation. Cale's face was a mask of fury. He had lost, not just the round, but the entire contest. Carter had proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that diplomacy, true diplomacy, was more powerful than the Empire's might. As Carter stood, the weight of his victory settling on him, he realized that this was only the beginning. The galaxy had taken its first step toward a future where peace was the goal, not domination. But he knew there would be more challenges ahead. The Empire might have lost today, but its thirst for control would never be quenched. The final vote had been cast, and the decision was clear. The Council had chosen Carter's vision of peace over the Empire's desire for control. For the first time in the history of the galaxy, the Empire had been defeated, not by force, but by the power of diplomacy. Carter had succeeded in his mission, not only for humanity, but for the entire galaxy. As the summit came to a close, the delegates stood and began to applaud. The room was filled with a mixture of emotions: relief, joy, and even a touch of disbelief. For so long, the Empire's shadow had loomed over every negotiation, every decision. But now, thanks to Carter's leadership, a new chapter was beginning. A chapter where the galaxy would no longer be governed by the fear of military might, but by the hope of peaceful cooperation. Lord Kale, standing at the back of the room, watched with a dark expression as the applause grew louder. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He had lost. There was no denying it now, but the fire in his eyes burned with renewed fury. This was not the end for the Empire. It was only a setback. Carter could feel Cal's gaze on him, but he refused to acknowledge it. He had won, but the work was far from over. The victory of the summit was just the beginning. There was still the matter of ensuring that the agreements made during the contest would be followed through on. There were systems still struggling, factions still at odds. And the Empire. Cal's defeat might have been public, but Carter knew that the Empire's influence was still deeply entrenched in many parts of the galaxy. The first few weeks after the summit were a whirlwind. Carter and his team worked tirelessly to ensure that the peace agreements between Loria and Valen were implemented. Both systems, once embroiled in decades of conflict, began to establish a new framework for cooperation. There were setbacks, of course. Old grudges die hard. But progress was being made, and that was what mattered. But the real test lay in the greater galaxy. Carter had secured peace between two systems, but what about the rest? How would other factions respond to the idea of a galaxy where diplomacy, not force, dictated the future? Could this new way of thinking spread across the stars, or would the Empire's toxic ideology still hold sway? One evening, as Carter sat in his quarters reviewing reports, a message arrived. It was from one of the more distant systems, one that had long been under the Empire's control. The message was short, but its implications were vast. The system's leaders were asking for Carter's help, asking for the same kind of peace that had been brokered at the summit. It was a request that Carter had been waiting for, but one that also weighed heavily on him. The Empire's grip on so many worlds was still firm. To challenge that grip, to bring more systems into the fold of peace, would be a monumental task. But Carter had already proven that change was possible. He had already shown that the galaxy could be led by hope and diplomacy, not fear and control. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be many more battles, both in the political sphere and beyond. The Empire, though weakened, was not broken. And even as Carter's vision for a united galaxy began to take root, the forces of oppression and division would continue to fight back. But Carter was undeterred. He had learned that even the smallest victories could lead to the greatest changes. His success at the summit had proven that one individual could challenge the status quo and inspire others to follow. The galaxy, once fractured by endless conflict, now had a chance to build something better, something lasting. As Carter looked out the window of his quarters, the stars stretched out before him, endless and full of possibility. He had come to the summit as a simple diplomat, but he was leaving it as a symbol of hope for the galaxy's future. There was still so much work to be done, but Carter knew one thing for certain: the Empire's reign of fear was over. And with the galaxy's leaders now focused on cooperation instead of conquest, a new era was beginning, one where peace and diplomacy would shape the future. He stood up, straightening his uniform, and made his way to the communications console. The next challenge was waiting, and he was ready for it. The galaxy needed him, and he would not turn his back on them now.